Okay, let's dive right in. The news out of Pahalgam, April 22nd, 2025. Just horrific. 27 civilians killed. A terror attack.
Yeah, including two foreign nationals. And the links seem pretty clear to Lashkar-e-Taiba.
The outrage in India was, well, completely understandable, immediate, intense. But what we're really unpacking in this deep dive isn't just the attack itself, horrifying as it was.
It's the response, isn't it? Specifically, India's decision regarding the Indus Waters Treaty, a move that, frankly, nobody really saw coming.
Exactly. We're talking about a treaty from 1960, brokered by the World Bank. It survived actual wars, 65, 71, Kargil, the aftermath of the Parliament attack.
Uh-huh. It was always seen as a sort of bedrock agreement, something constant despite all the conflict. For India to suddenly say they're keeping it in abeyance, that's huge.
It feels like a major shift in strategic thinking.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to understand why. What exactly is this treaty? What does putting it in abeyance actually mean on the ground?
And crucially, what are the potential ripple effects? Especially for Pakistan, given how vital this water is.
Right. What happens when this agreement, designed, for peace through shared resources, becomes tangled up in counterterrorism strategy?
Well, to really get it, you have to go back to 1947, the partition. It didn't just divide land and people, it sliced right through the Indus River basin.
So the rivers Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, Sutlej suddenly crossed a new international border.
Precisely. And India became the upper riparian state, meaning the rivers start there or flow through India first before reaching Pakistan.
Which naturally creates tension over water access, I imagine.
Mhm.
Your lifeline now starts in another country.
Exactly. It sparked disputes almost immediately. There was a temporary fix, the Delhi Agreement in 48, but bilateral talks stalled.
So enter the World Bank.
Right. They came in around 1951, spent nearly a decade mediating. The idea was to find a way to divide the waters to prevent conflict.
And the solution was this division, eastern and western rivers.
That's the core of the 1960 treaty. The eastern rivers, Ravi, Beas, Sutlej, went to India.
Yeah.
The western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, were allocated largely to Pakistan for unrestricted use.
But India still had some rights on those western rivers.
Yes, limited rights, domestic use, some agriculture, and non-consumptive uses like run-of-the-river hydroelectric power. But the key point here, and it's fascinating,
Yeah.
despite being upstream, India essentially agreed to let over 80% of the total water in the basin flow downstream to Pakistan. A massive concession, really.
80%. Wow. That underscores how much this was about trying to build some kind of stability, even back then.
It was a huge geopolitical calculation, and remarkably, it held for over 60 years. Through thick and thin, that's the context for why this recent move feels so dramatic.
So let's pin down the terms a bit more. We have the river allocation. What else was key?
Well, there was a 10-year transition period built in to allow Pakistan time to build replacement canals and infrastructure for the waters it was losing from the eastern rivers.
Okay.
And India actually contributed financially to that, about 62 million pounds sterling back then, which was a significant sum.
So financial aid was part of the deal, too.
Yes. And critically, they established the Permanent Indus Commission, the PIC. This was meant to be the forum for regular data exchange, inspections, cooperation, and resolving any technical issues.
The PIC. So that's the mechanism that's now, well, in abeyance.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Halting that routine cooperation.
Now, you said the treaty survived wars, but it surely wasn't all smooth sailing. There must have been disputes.
Oh, absolutely. Plenty of turbulence. It's prevented major water wars, which is its success, but disputes over interpretation have been constant.
Mostly about
India's hydroelectric projects on the western rivers, the ones allocated to Pakistan.
like Baglihar. I remember that one making headlines.
Exactly. Baglihar on the Chenab. Pakistan objected strongly, claimed the design allowed for too much water storage, potentially giving India control over flows.
And how was that resolved?
It went to a neutral expert appointed via the World Bank. The ruling in 2007 largely favored India's design with some minor modifications.
Okay. Any other major ones?
Kishanganga is another big one. That's on a tributary of the Jhelum. Pakistan worried about water diversion affecting its own downstream projects.
Right.
That went to a full court of arbitration. In 2013, they allowed India to proceed but mandated minimum environmental flows downstream.
So a pattern emerges. India wants to build hydro projects allowed by the treaty. Pakistan objects fearing flow manipulation, and it goes to dispute resolution.
Pretty much. You also have ongoing issues or past disputes around projects like Rattle, Tobol. It's a recurring theme. Suspicion, differing interpretations of technical details.
But, and this seems crucial, have these international bodies ever actually found India in violation of the treaty?
That's the key takeaway from the past disputes. No. The findings have generally been about interpreting the treaty's complex annexures or mandating specific operational modes, not that India broke the fundamental rules.
So the objections are more about potential capability and mistrust, rather than proven illegal actions by India.
You could certainly argue that yes, but that persistent mistrust is a huge factor in the background noise surrounding the treaty.
Okay, let's pivot to Pakistan's perspective. You mentioned how vital this water is. Just how dependent are they?
Fundamentally dependent. The Indus system is Pakistan's lifeline. Agriculture is, around 19–20% of their GDP?
A big chunk.
And it employs nearly 40% of the workforce. Over 90% of that agricultural land relies on irrigation from the Indus Basin. We're talking wheat, sugarcane, rice, cotton, their core crops.
90%, that's staggering reliance, especially on rivers originating, for the most part, in India.
It highlights their vulnerability. And this decision by India keeping the treaty in abeyance, well, the potential economic shockwaves are serious.
How so? What could actually happen?
Well, the immediate concern would be disruption to seasonal flows or delays in getting that crucial water data from the PIC. Sowing seasons Rabi in winter, Kharif in summer are timed very carefully based on expected water availability.
Right. Farmers need predictability.
Exactly. Even a, say, 15–20% reduction in water early in the season could slash agricultural output by maybe 10–15%.
And the knock-on effect for their GDP.
Some analysts suggest it could potentially shave off up to 2% from their GDP. That's a significant contraction.
And beyond GDP, we're talking about people's livelihoods.
Absolutely. Job losses in the countryside, which could fuel more migration to cities that are already struggling, pushing more people into poverty.
And this is happening against a backdrop of existing economic challenges in Pakistan, right? High inflation.
Precisely. This would almost certainly make things worse, especially food prices, if agricultural output drops.
There was also a point about water storage capacity differences.
Yes, that's another vulnerability. Pakistan can only store about 30 days' worth of its water flow. India, by contrast, has storage for around 120 days, maybe more now.
30 days isn't much of a buffer.
Not at all. And they're already considered a country nearing absolute scarcity for water. So any reduction or even just uncertainty about flows puts them under immense pressure, severe water stress.
It paints a picture of extreme dependence. Now, the sources also mention this long-running narrative within Pakistan about India trying to choke their water supply.
Yes, that's been a consistent theme for decades. You hear it from political leaders, parts of the media, even extremist groups like the ones associated with Hafiz Saeed in the past.
Portraying India as having this malevolent intent to turn off the tap.
Right. Despite the fact, as we discussed, that no international body has ever validated claims of India actually violating the treaty's water-sharing terms. There have even been veiled threats about treating Indian dam projects as acts of war.
So if it's not backed by proven violations, what's the political purpose of this narrative?
Well, domestically, it's incredibly useful. It deflects attention from Pakistan's own internal water management problems, things like inefficient irrigation, lack of investment, leaky canals.
And interprovincial disputes, too.
Yes, major ones. Particularly between Punjab, which is powerful and upstream within Pakistan, and the downstream provinces of Sindh and Balochistan. Blaming India is often easier than tackling those thorny internal issues.
Makes sense. And internationally.
It helps cast Pakistan as a victim, potentially garnering sympathy or diplomatic leverage. And as mentioned, it's unfortunately been fuel for extremist propaganda as well.
But here's a question that arises from that. If the treaty so overwhelmingly benefits Pakistan in terms of water volume, that 80% figure you mentioned, why haven't they ever withdrawn?
That's the logical question, isn't it? But withdrawing from a treaty that guarantees them the vast majority of the basin's water would be, well, strategically questionable.
They might get less in a renegotiation.
It's highly possible. Plus, the treaty is legally complex, with the one bank deeply involved. Unilaterally pulling out would be messy, legally and possibly financially. It seems the propaganda is more about political signaling than a real desire to scrap the deal.
Which brings us back to India's move, keeping it in abeyance. It really does feel like crossing a Rubicon, breaking from that long history of separating water from other conflicts.
It absolutely signals a major shift, that inherited idealism, as one source put it. The idea of upholding the treaty almost regardless of other provocations seems to have ended with the Pahalgam attack. National security interests are now clearly linked to the treaty's status.
So what does in abeyance likely mean in practical terms? What will India do now?
The immediate steps seem to be halting cooperation through the Permanent Indus Commission. So no more routine meetings, no more regular sharing of hydrological data.
Freezing the information flow.
Yes. And perhaps more significantly, signaling an intent to accelerate India's own projects on the Western rivers, hydro, irrigation, storage projects that are permitted under the treaty's rules but have often been stalled or delayed by Pakistani objections.
So using the full extent of their rights under the treaty, which they perhaps haven't aggressively pursued before because of the cooperative spirit, power strain.
That appears to be the new posture. Less restraint, more focus on maximizing India's own entitlements under the agreement. It moves the treaty from a symbol of cooperation, however flawed, to a potential point of leverage.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. The key takeaway seems clear. Pahalgam was a catalyst for a fundamental change in India's approach to the Indus Waters Treaty.
Definitely. It's now viewed not just as a water-sharing agreement, but as an element within India's broader strategic response to cross-border terrorism.
And the potential consequences are, well, quite alarming. Economic instability in Pakistan, heightened political friction.
And what does this mean for regional stability overall? It's a big question mark.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can a treaty like this, born from a desire for peace through shared resources, actually function when the underlying trust is just gone?
Or does the resource itself, the Indus water, inevitably become weaponized in the conflict, a boundary instead of a bridge?
And looking wider, in a world facing more water scarcity, more climate change pressure, more geopolitical tension. What does this episode tell us about the future of water diplomacy? Can these kinds of agreements hold?
It's a deeply provocative thought to end on. Will cooperation over shared water survive these pressures, or is this Indus situation a grim preview of future resource conflicts, something for all of us, especially you listening, to really think about?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical and pretty complex issue. The Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan.
Absolutely. It sits right at the heart of their relationship, doesn't it?
It really does. And one of you sent in some fascinating material looking specifically at India's perspective on this agreement, which has been around, what, over 60 years now?
Since 1960, yeah. A long time.
So our mission today is to really dig into that, unpack India's arguments based on these sources, understand the history, their main grievances, and maybe get a sense of where things might be heading.
We've got articles here outlining India's stance, their justifications for possibly rethinking things.
Exactly. And it leads to a big question, doesn't it? Can a treaty that was meant for cooperation actually survive when there's persistent hostility and, the whole geopolitical situation keeps changing?
That's the core tension, I think. Let's jump in.
Okay. So maybe start with the basics. The treaty itself from 1960.
Right. So the Indus Waters Treaty, 1960, basically it divided up the Indus River system. India got exclusive use of the three eastern rivers. That's the Ravi, Beas, and Sutlej.
Okay.
And Pakistan got the three western rivers, the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab. That's the fundamental split.
But the sources you sent in really stress how India saw this split from day one. They call it a highly concessional arrangement.
Very generous, you could say, because Pakistan ended up with nearly 80% of the total water volume.
Even though India is upstream for all 6 rivers.
Exactly. India is the upper riparian for all of them. So from India's viewpoint, as laid out here, this was a huge act of accommodation, especially right after partition, with no compensation involved.
So that framing as a big concession early on seems really important for understanding their current thinking, maybe. Like they feel they gave a lot initially.
Precisely. It sets the stage, because the treaty does still give India certain rights on those western rivers, the ones allocated to Pakistan.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't a total handover of the western rivers?
No, not entirely. These sources are clear. The treaty allows India limited irrigation use, domestic use, and this is key, the construction of run-of-the-river hydroelectric projects.
Run of the river.
Yeah.
So not massive dams that store huge amounts of water.
Generally, yes. Think more like using the river's natural flow to generate power without significantly altering the downstream volume over time, less disruptive than large storage dams.
Right. But this is where the friction comes in, according to these articles.
This seems to be a major sticking point, yes. India's perspective, as presented here, is that whenever they try to exercise these permitted rights building a hydro project, for instance, Pakistan objects,
This minor objections or...
often quite significant ones, Pakistan frequently escalates these disputes, taking them to international arbitration or other platforms.
The effect of that.
Delays, lots of delays, plus diplomatic friction. India sees this, according to the sources, as a pattern of obstruction, maybe even a way to hinder India's development, especially in Jammu and Kashmir.
Which links directly to the next point, the impact on Jammu and Kashmir's development.
Exactly. The sources argue the treaty actively impedes development there. Jammu and Kashmir, they estimate, has this massive hydroelectric potential, maybe 20,000 megawatts?
Wow, that's a lot.
Huge. But they've only managed to develop a tiny fraction of it.
And the treaty is the reason why.
It's presented as a major factor. The limits on water storage and flow regulation, well, they restrict the kind of large-scale projects that could really boost energy independence and economic growth in the region.
So people in the region must feel this quite strongly.
Apparently so. One source mentions the Jammu and Kashmir state legislature repeatedly asking for the treaty to be reviewed or even scrapped, citing economic and developmental injustice.
That's strong language. So this developmental bottleneck feeds into calls for modernizing the treaty.
It certainly seems to be a driver. India's argument, as outlined here, is that the treaty is, well, a product of its time. 1960, the world's changed.
How so? What needs updating?
They point to things like climate change, which is impacting river flows, glaciers melting in the Himalayas. Then there's increased water demand, naturally, and a growing focus on environmental conservation.
Things that weren't really on the radar in 1960.
Not in the same way. The treaty, these sources say, doesn't have proper provisions for water quality or for ensuring minimum ecological flows needed to keep the rivers healthy, or even for managing disasters like floods, which are becoming more critical with erratic monsoons.
And Pakistan's response to discussing these updates.
The article suggests Pakistan has been resistant to even opening talks about treaty reform. They seem to prefer the status quo.
Which leads to this narrative of India practicing strategic restraint.
Yes. The sources really emphasize this. They argue that despite numerous provocations, and they explicitly mention state-sponsored terrorism and diplomatic hostility from Pakistan, India hasn't weaponized water.
Meaning they haven't just cut off the flow from the rivers they control.
Right. They haven't used their upstream position as leverage in that way, despite, having the capacity to do so.
And they argue their own projects follow the rules.
They insist their projects stick to the treaty's technical standards, often very strict ones, and these projects often face international checks because Pakistan requests them. India frames this as showing hydrological transparency and legal discipline.
Contrasting that with what they see as obstructionism from the other side.
Exactly. And because of this perceived unfairness, this asymmetry, there's now a growing school of thought in India, according to these sources, pushing for a strategic rethink of the IWT.
A rethink meaning what exactly? Scrapping it?
Not necessarily scrapping it outright, or even denying Pakistan water its due under the treaty. It seems more focused on ensuring India can fully utilize its own rights within the treaty.
Like what?
Like building the permitted water storage, finishing allowed irrigation projects, maybe exploring legal ways to formally revise the treaty terms if cooperation isn't forthcoming. It's about maximizing their entitlement.
So using the treaty's own mechanisms, but more assertively.
That seems to be the argument presented here. It connects to the idea of water being a strategic lever in South Asia.
Right. The sources call it a potent instrument of national power.
And they again highlight India's decades of sticking to the treaty, despite, as they put it, Pakistan waging a proxy war through cross-border terrorism.
There's that asymmetry again. India feels constrained by the treaty while facing aggression.
Yes. And the sources don't shy away from listing examples: the 2001 Parliament attack, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, Uri and Pahalgam in 2016 as context for why this rethink is happening now.
So the argument is the treaty was meant for goodwill, but it's turned into a liability because of this hostility.
That's the framing. A liability because, one, Pakistan allegedly blocks legitimate Indian projects under the treaty.
Okay.
And two, Pakistan uses the treaty context, ironically, to paint India negatively on the world stage, the water terrorist accusation they mention.
Even while India sees itself as the victim of actual terrorism.
That's the core of the grievance expressed in these sources. It leads to questions about the legal and moral basis for changing course.
can they legally change it? Does the treaty allow for changes or exits?
Well, the sources say there's no unilateral exit clause. You can't just walk away.
Ah,
But Article 12 does allow for modification or termination if both sides agree through negotiation. And Article 7 encourages future cooperation, which India says Pakistan hasn't really engaged with meaningfully.
so negotiation is the official path. But what if that doesn't work? What about this idea of suspension?
That's a key point in the material. Suspension wouldn't necessarily mean turning off the taps completely overnight.
Right.
It's presented more as a recalibration of rights within the treaty's permissible limits.
Meaning?
It could mean things like speeding up work on projects India is allowed to build anyway, maximizing the water storage they're entitled to, maybe being more strategic about when water is released downstream, actions that might still be, arguably, within their legal rights under the treaty itself.
I see. It's more about flexing the muscle the treaty already allows them.
That seems to be the interpretation offered here. Now, interestingly, the sources bring in a comparison China and the Brahmaputra River.
Right, where China's the upper riparian, like India's on the Indus. How does that compare?
It's quite different, actually. First, the geography and hydrology. Only about 20–30% of the Brahmaputra's water comes from Tibet, where China is.
Oh, really? Where does the rest come from?
Mostly rainfall and tributaries inside India, in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. So India contributes the majority of the flow downstream.
That's a huge difference from the Indus, where India controls the sources of most of the water flowing to Pakistan.
Exactly. It means China's ability to significantly impact India's water supply by damming or diverting the Brahmaputra is, hydrologically speaking, more limited, especially during the monsoon.
Are there other differences? What about treaties?
Big difference there, too. There's no comprehensive water-sharing treaty between India and China on the Brahmaputra, unlike the IWT.
No treaty at all.
Not a binding one governing flows. But the sources argue China still faces constraints, practical ones, like the huge technical challenges and costs of massive diversion projects in the Himalayas,
Okay.
and diplomatic ones. There's the massive trade relationship, over $120 billion annually. China might be wary of jeopardizing that over water.
Plus their international image.
Right. Being seen as a water bully wouldn't help their peaceful rise narrative, especially in forums like BRICS or the SKO, where both are members. It could push India closer to other powers.
Have they used water as pressure before?
The sources mention China withholding hydrological data during the Doklam standoff in 2017, but they frame that as more symbolic, lacking the real structural impact that, say, India suspending IWT cooperation could have on Pakistan.
So the Brahmaputra situation is seen as less of a potential flashpoint compared to the Indus.
That's the conclusion drawn here, yes. Which brings us back to the core argument for why India might consider suspending the IWT.
What's the strategic rationale boiled down?
It's essentially that the treaty is a relic of a different era, signed before decades of what India views as Pakistan-sponsored asymmetric warfare.
And India's restraint hasn't paid off.
That's the argument. 6 decades of honoring the treaty despite attacks, loss of life. The sources suggest this restraint hasn't brought strategic benefits and might have even emboldened Pakistan.
So continuing as is seen as strategic self-harm.
That's the phrase used. The choice is framed as keep subsidizing a hostile state with vital water, or recalibrate the relationship using the treaty as leverage for security goals.
And suspension is seen as a way to send a message.
A strong message, yes, to Pakistan and the world, redefining the terms of engagement. And crucially, they argue it could be a lawful, proportionate, non-military way to assert sovereign rights.
A deterrent, maybe, given Pakistan's reliance on Indus water for its economy.
That's definitely part of the calculation presented. Pakistan's economy is vulnerable, heavily reliant on Indus agriculture. The credible threat of water flow regulation could, theoretically, force Islamabad to rethink its alleged support for militant groups. It's about non-kinetic pressure.
What about the humanitarian angle? People in Pakistan need that water.
The sources acknowledge this is a concern, but argue it needs to be weighed against the ongoing cost to India, lives lost, security challenges. The distinction they make is important. It's not necessarily about denying water altogether.
But about making access conditional.
Exactly. Conditional on reciprocal good faith. The phrase used is basically, if Pakistan wants uninterrupted water, it must ensure uninterrupted peace, linking the two directly.
So the final word from these sources is pretty clear.
Quite forceful, yeah. The IWT isn't sacred scripture. It's a man-made contract. It needs to reflect reality. And in the current reality, they argue, suspending or renegotiating isn't aggression, it's self-preservation. a nonviolent tool against terror.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. After digging into these sources on India's perspective, what's the main takeaway?
Well, it seems India feels it has a strong case, built on several pillars, for reconsidering its approach to the IWT.
Pillars like.
Like the history, that initial big concession, the developmental needs, especially in Jammu and Kashmir, the huge security concerns stemming from cross-border terrorism, and this feeling that Pakistan hasn't reciprocated the cooperative spirit the treaty was supposed to embody.
It certainly raises some very difficult questions for you, the listener, to mull over. You know, ethically, how do you balance sharing a vital resource like water against national security threats and ongoing conflict?
And what are the potential ripple effects? If a treaty like this is recalibrated, what does that mean for stability across the whole region? It's a delicate situation.
Absolutely. If you want to explore this further, it's worth looking up the actual text of the Indus Waters Treaty.
Definitely. And read different analyses, look at their geopolitics from various angles. It's crucial to try and grasp all the perspectives involved in such a long-running and, frankly, sensitive issue.
Because ultimately we're left with this thought: water gives life, it can be a bridge for cooperation. But can it also become a tool, a lever perhaps, to try and reset relationships when faced with really persistent, deep-seated challenges?
A powerful question to end on.
Indeed. Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.